Hi, everyone. So, in this lecture, we will be discussing the film The Name of the Rose, directed by Jean-Jacques Annaud, the French uh, director, um, based on a novel by Umberto Eco, an Italian professor of semiotics. And what we'll be doing is framing it within the context of thinking about modernity, what it means to be modern, which is the theme of this class. But as you'll see, it helps us weave in all kinds of discussions of philosophy and whatnot. I'll try to make it quick. I don't know whether this lecture would make more sense before you watch the film or after, but in either case, I do not do spoilers. Don't worry about that. There are not spoilers in the film in this lecture. Let's begin. So the way I framed it is with my discussion of the name of the rose is with this question: pre-modern, modern, postmodern. Why is everything measured by the modern? And this is how we refer to things very often. We talk about modernity, and if we're talking about the past, we talk about it being pre-modern. And of course, you've heard the term postmodern or postmodernism. Postmodernism and the postmodern are different things, as you'll see. But let's get started by talking about the film. The Name of the Rose. As I said, it's by a professor of semiotics who wrote a novel, a sort of mystery novel called The Name of the Rose in Italian. Now, it's interesting. What is semiotics? Semiotics is the study of signs. It's the study of symbols. In other words, it's the study of the way human beings communicate. And to me, that's an important part of what's going on here. That title, The Name of the Rose, in part refers to the quotation that comes at the end of the film, and that's not in any way a spoiler. It translates to, the pristine rose stands in name. We hold nothing but empty names, right? The rose is gone, in other words. The rose has vanished. We have no rose. Now we just have the name. That's all we have. This is a line from a writing, the Carmen de Horto by a medieval poet and philosopher, Hugo of St. Victor. And why I think that's important is that Hugo of St. Victor was himself a rationalist who advocated having some sort of rational knowledge that was separate from theology. But let me get deeper into this idea of the name of the rose and how I think it matters. First, if you think about it, if all we have is the name of the rose and we've lost the rose itself, what's that really saying about history? Well, in a sense, it's saying that there might have been these wonderful things, let's say in our religious history, such as Jesus, God, Christianity. Do we have those anymore? Or do we have these sort of semblances of those things? Do we have names that poorly reflect the reality of them? I think that's a theme in the film. And I think in a way, that is a commentary on the history of the church. If you've watched the film, and if you haven't, it's kind of pretty clear early on. The film is very much about the corruption of the church, and you'll see in the film different orders who have different views on how they should live. One preaches poverty. The order that we see primarily in the film preaches poverty, but is kind of hypocritical in that they eat pretty well. They leech off of the surrounding community, the people that surround their monastery, and are in abject poverty and don't even have food. And then at the same time, they judge other orders that believe in dressing nicely. And you'll see that they come in sort of in the film. So the church has kind of has disintegrated in a way in this film. And so what do you have? Do you have the church, or do you have the name of the church, right? They speak a lot about Jesus and God. Do you really have Jesus and God in a community that can't help or serve other people? Or do you rather have the name of Jesus and the name of God? And I think that's a theme right there. Lastly, I'll say another incredibly important element in the film, I think, is the female figure in the film. And actually, this is a bit of a spoiler. So if you want, you can like mute or fast forward, or maybe just watch the film. This is a tiny spoiler. But the younger character in the film whose name escapes me. Otto? I can't remember. The younger monk played by Christian Slater, who's accompanying the monk William. Um, he falls in love with a woman, and um, he has a relationship with her, and he says that he never even knew her name. So she has a name. She has no name, but she's real. Do you see how that contrasts with the church? He has fallen in love with a real person. He has had this intense relationship with a real person. He has no name for her. He just has the reality. So it's fascinating because it makes love and humanity real, and church and faith and institutions not real. The church and faith and institutions are connected with names. They have names, they have words, and they're obsessed with words, as you see with the scribbling and the monks who are just they worship their library, they hide it, and books matter so much to them that that's kind of a central problem in it. Is they're terrified of what books can do. So they're obsessed with words and names, but there's no connection to reality, humanity, love. On the other hand, you have love and real love, and yet no name, right? That's the sort of the meaninglessness of language, in other words, is a key part of it. And of course, I think what's implied also by the name of the rose is, if not implied, I mean, the thematically works so perfectly. William Shakespeare's attribution to Juliet, the quote from Juliet, where she says about Romeo, who has a family name that, of course, doesn't work with her life. I mean, the rivalry between the two families is a big part of the play. She laments the fact that he has this family name and says a rose by any other name would smell sweet. In other words, what do names matter, right? I know who I love. That's real. Love transcends words. Okay. Some other themes that appear in the film that matter: faith versus faith, or superstition, really, versus reason. Right? Our main character represents. He's really a detective in the mold of Sherlock Holmes. I mean, I don't think that's an accident, right? It's not an accident. It's made to be that way. He's a monk version of Sherlock Holmes, and he's very well read, right? William of Baskerville, right? Of course, that's a reference to Sherlock Holmes, because Baskerville, of course, the Hound of the Baskervilles is the most famous Sherlock Holmes story, and he's not a real historical person. William of Baskerville, it's made up. William of Baskerville represents reason, right? In the face of superstition. And throughout the film, you'll see this, right? Every time somebody dies or something happens, they're talking about the devil. They're talking about things that transcend reason. William of Baskerville stands there to represent reason. Fear versus laughter, right? That's a huge theme in this film. Laughter is connected to reason and the humanities and and things not being religious because of the figure of Aristotle. So one of the key things in the film is the reference to this lost second half of the Poetics on the virtues of laughter, right? So the church figures, who are mainly presented as superstitious, they're also anti-laughter. Laughter is something visceral. It's animal. It comes from deep within. It's a loss of control. And yet it's very human. It causes people to relate to each other, right? And has a connection to reason through the figure of Aristotle, which allows the William of Baskerville figure to advocate laughter, right? Selfishness versus love. That's with the Christian Slater's character, right? He is the perfect example of being unselfish. He loves without any selfishness, right? He cares so much that he would even put himself in danger, right? And you'll notice this phrase that occurs between him and William of Baskerville. He said, "As a friend, tell me as a friend. Don't tell me as you're my mentor. Tell me as a friend," right? Because that's what being honest is about, and that's a big theme in the film: honesty versus hypocrisy. Okay. I think all of these come together to give us a sense in the film of what's called humanism. And humanism is this idea that at some point in time, supposedly, we can argue against this, at some point in time, people became more interested in a view of the universe that puts the human at the center as opposed to God and, let's say, religion. Humans and the way they feel and the way they think matters. And that's humanism. And I think that's a major theme in the film. I would say that the film teases the idea of modernity by giving us this figure of William of Baskerville. He in a way is us. We identify with him. We're put in the midst of these people who are not at all interested in reason and in real deep learning and in deep understanding. And the contrast to it is that we're given this figure of William, but then William himself, at times, this is what makes the film so complex. William himself, we can't identify with him because he's so cold and calculating, and his rejection of love. It also isn't completely what we know to be true, and I would say modern. Right now, don't let this confuse you. Most have said that this film is definitely a postmodern film. I don't want to get into that now. I'm just talking about the way it focuses on now, modernity, versus looking at a past that's kind of weighed down by religion and superstition. So again, in the film, the heart and love is put in contrast to the intellect. And that's a complexity because there are figures, monks in it, who say, trust your heart, don't trust your intellect so much, to William of Baskerville. And that might be I think that's a worthy criticism of William of Baskerville, as comes out throughout the film. He's unable to connect with the heart. So you can see my notes here. I won't go too much more into this because I want to keep it short. But again, remember, all depictions of the past are actually ways that we are thinking about the now. Of course, in 1986 when the film is made, or in 1980 when the novel is written, but the now, right? Who are we? That's what we're talking about when we depict the past. We're not actually depicting the past. You can't depict the past, right? You can interpret the past. And when you interpret the past and you bring it into the present, you're showing yourself. You're not showing the past. That's the important thing about this film. Okay, so let's move on a bit, and I'll go quickly through my next few slides, trying to make this lecture not too long. So when we're thinking about this film, and we're thinking about the triumph of learning over superstition, I can't help but think about the word medieval, right? The film takes place in the medieval world, right? Well, what is medieval? Medieval means literally middle age. Middle of what? It's in between the classics, the Greeks, the ancients, and what was at one time the modern, and now we call the Renaissance, right? So some awakening happened. Renaissance, it means rebirth, a rebirth of knowledge, supposedly. This is the narrative we've been given. Sorry. This is the narrative we've been given, that there was this rebirth of knowledge that happened in Europe, this rediscovery of ancient wisdom. Listen, I will tell you as a fact that there wasn't some sudden rebirth. Yes, there was a movement called Italian humanism that definitely affected your other European thinkers. But there wasn't this sudden movement against religion. The Italian humanists were very religious, and it wasn't as clear cut as we would think. I quote here a really wonderful article by Henrik Lagerlundis. I hope I pronounced that right. Lagerlundis from Sweden. It's questionable that there ever really was a movement other than in the mind of 19th and early 20th century historians. In other words, words like Renaissance, even words like medieval, were things that later on historians applied to the past by reading the past a certain way, right? What Lagerlundis advocates is something called historiographical nihilism, that there are no such thing as historical periods. We can use them temporarily so that we can make sense of things as we discuss them, but actually once we do, we have to also break them down and see how they're not true, right? Moving along, what is the Enlightenment? And how does that matter to the film? the reading that you had by Josephson's Storm, Jason Josephson's Storm, um, is about the Enlightenment and how the Enlightenment is not a real thing. It's a made-up concept. The Enlightenment should matter to us as Americans, because the Constitution that we have is an Enlightenment era document. If you think about how excited the quote unquote founding fathers were to establish this new thing, that there was hints of it in France, but this new thing, a democracy, a democratic republic by the people, for the people, of the people, all that, right? Those values come out of a certain way of thinking that responded to Europe's history. Okay, what had happened in Europe before were religious wars. A lot of them. Look at the PowerPoint slide. You'll see that most of these wars, French Wars of Religion, 30 Years' War, English Civil Wars, Dutch Revolt, they were Catholics versus Protestants. And so the problem developed, how can we establish a state that brings together everything we know to be true from the ancient Greeks and we know to work for us, and do so in a way that that won't lead to the religious wars that we're seeing, right? So we have to get the church out of the state. Separation of church and state became a part of that. Also in the Enlightenment, there was an idea that reason could govern things. And if reason's governing things, then we have to develop rules that work within that all the time. And so you get what quote unquote laws the way we know them. Laws written on paper that apply to everyone, no matter who they are, where they are, when they are, right? And those laws also govern the universe. There was an idea that the universe works like a machine and it has these laws. We now know that's not completely true. But anyways, that was the idea then, right? And all of this was contrary to the religious and quote unquote superstitious way that people had lived before. The major thinkers of that time, Kant, Voltaire, John Locke, they contributed to the reception of these ideas, right? Universal truths, politics that's governed in a kind of secular or in other words non-state way. And by the way, a lot of these are great ideas. I'm not putting the ideas down, but it's just the fact that you have to know that they developed in history in reaction to a certain historical situation. They're very European, and they're very much about the way Europeans lived. And the danger of them, by the way, was that if something is universally true, and we're governed by reason, then that means others should be governed by us if they lack reason. And that's the way Europeans very often saw the non-Europeans, that they were people who lacked reason. They lived superstitious lives. So we have the right to rule and govern and dominate them. And once we do, we'll help them draft up these universal laws. So Sharia law, for example, from what I study, the Islamic studies context, people don't know that Sharia law was a British invention that occurred in India. I can explain that later, but it has to do with this. Sharia wasn't law ever. There wasn't an idea that there was a universal law that you would write in paper. It wasn't like that. Well, that's for a different day. I have gone on too long, but I'm almost done. I have 2 or 3 more slides, real quick. What is modernity then? And how does that relate to the film? Well, I struggle to think of the film as a modernist film or as a postmodernist film, and here's why. I think it has modernist, in a lot of ways, it has modernist depictions, but it's postmodern in its complexity. Let me explain what I mean by that, and then I'll end. When we say modernity, we're talking about a historical period. That historical period starts roughly around, we'll say, I would say more the 1800s, but it says approximately 17th to 19th century. Rise of industrialization, urbanization, secularization, the modern world as we know it. People living in a faster paced world. Feudalism is now over. We are now, living in cities and working in factories. And with modernism came certain key values. The idea that, the world is moving toward progress. We have to reject the past. It's a negative view of the past. And you'll see a lot of those Enlightenment values are now becoming part of modernism. And what makes the difference is that it is in part with technology and the way people view themselves. In modernism, the individual matters more than the group. It's a lot about the individual, and it's about the idea that the individual can be a part of progress and themselves progress, and uh, that what happens in your mind as an individual matters a lot, right? So when did this era end? Well, it depends on who you ask. I won't get into that, but it seems to be over. I mean, if you know, but it's not. You'll see modernity and modernism. Modernism is the artistic part of modernity. Modernism is an artistic movement, but you'll also see modernism in not just in the visual arts, but in novels and poetry. Um, it doesn't have to have ended because it affects all of us. It has been replaced by something called postmodernism, or we live in a postmodern era, some would say. But that's only if you embrace that. It depends on who is thinking that way. When we talk about modernism in art, we're talking about these values that I've been talking about, but in artistic depiction. So here we see Picasso's girl looking into a mirror. In Picasso's girl looking into a mirror, he's broken with tradition. She's looking into a mirror, so it's very much about the self and reflecting on the self and the inner world of the self, right? He's there are no more rules on one hand, but on the same hand, on the other hand, there's also an emphasis on human creativity, newness, progress, interiority. That changes with the postmodern. The postmodern is much more about the fact that we've lost hope in the idea that we can effectively make meaning. So the postmodern is much more, it happens sort of mid 20th century till now, though some would say we're postmodern. I won't get into that. In the postmodern, we don't think there are any sort of ultimate truths, grand narratives that we can accept and embrace, right? In the postmodern, everything's fragmented. There are multiple truths all the time. Everybody has their own truth, but they're not really true. And knowledge is really just a way that, for the postmodern thinkers, knowledge is really just a way that people impose their will or power over others. Knowledge is produced. It's not discovered. There's not a discovery of knowledge. There's a production of it. And it's produced by people who want to control others. It's produced very often by institutions or those who want to wield power. In art, what we call postmodernism takes those values and applies them to art. So you'll see, it says here, eclecticism, irony, self-referentiality. What that means is things begin to break down. And instead of creating things with this kind of hope that modernism had and the individuality, it's the idea that I'm going to take symbols that are around me and put them together, right? It's a breaking down of meaning. So in the postmodern, I'm trying to show you how fragmented my reality is. So in this, Andy Warhol's painting here, you'll see he's taken prints of Marilyn Monroe and just repeated them over and over again. And there's different colors on the side. Why? Because look at what he's saying here, right? He's saying this is an image you have. This is a photo of a person. And now I'm taking the photo of a person and I'm making something new with it because there is nothing new. Nothing is ever really created. Everything is just fragmented, repeated, things like that. So is the book modern or is it postmodern? I mean, not the book, the film. That's a really good question. I'll leave it to you to answer it. But I think I would say that its view of knowledge, superstition, and all of what I've discovered, and even words and language, has a modernist angle. But because at the end you're left, there isn't a hero at the end of this. Okay, it's not a spoiler. There isn't a hero, and you're not happy with how things turn out at the end. That is kind of a spoiler. Because of that, I think it's very postmodern. It's not like it ends with some ultimate truth. So the depiction of history is modernist, but the whole of it is very postmodern because there isn't any answer. It's like William of Baskerville looks at things this way. The monks look at things this way. Christian Slater's character, I really should have looked it up before. I forgot his name and I should have looked it up before the lecture, but you know who I'm talking about, the young monk. He looks at things another way. The lady the lady of the village lady looks at things another way. And it's right. Everybody has their own reality by the end. That's postmodern. I'll let you think of Jason Joseph Storm's writing in the context of what we've seen. But these are the questions I would think about when it comes to the film. Who gets to say what science is, right? If you look at if you look at the film, science back then would have meant knowledge, and science back then would have been philosophy, right? Because Aristotle is a scientist and he's a philosopher. They were one thing. Science really does literally just mean knowledge. What Joseph Storm asks us is, at what point did science and philosophy become two different things, right? You think about that in the reading. Were Enlightenment thinkers rational or superstitious? So Joseph Storm's asking this question. Well, I would say that's the wrong question, right? Enlightenment thinkers were both rational and superstitious. They were obsessed with magic and the occult, but they were intelligent. Isaac Newton, I mean, wow, brilliant, right? But at the same time, we would call him superstitious. And I think the fact that we've separated those two things says more about us than it did about them. In the film, there is a distinction between superstitious and rational. So once again, it's buying into a narrative of progress and modernity. Okay? And these are the key questions I want you to think about. I will post these questions. I won't answer them because I've talked about some of them quite a bit, but I want you to think about them. Thank you for listening. Sorry if I went on too long. And if you haven't seen the movie, I hope you enjoy it. If you have, I bet you enjoyed it. If you didn't, let me know and let me know why. All right.